Episode 1. Too much pleasure, too much pain. Nick sat on the edge of the bed, his hands buried in his hair, fingers pulling at his scalp as if he could tear the thoughts from his mind. The room was dim, the only light coming from the dying glow of a cigarette smoldering in the ashtray by the window. It wasn't just the smoke that hung heavy in the air. It was the suffocating weight of something far more toxic, his relationship with Lena. He reached for the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the nightstand. His hands were shaking as he poured another glass. The amber liquid swirled in the glass, catching what little light there was, mocking him with the promise of temporary oblivion. His throat burned as the alcohol slid down, but it did nothing to ease the ache gnawing at him from the inside. His mind flashed back to Kurt, an old friend who had once stood at the same precipice Nick was teetering on now. "Too much pleasure is pain, man," Kurt had told him one night after they both had too much to drink. At the time, Nick had laughed it off, thinking Kurt was just being dramatic. But now, sitting in the dark, the weight of those words pressed against his chest. Pleasure. Pain. They had become indistinguishable. Each high with Lena was followed by a crash so devastating it left him gasping for air. The problem was, Nick didn't know how to let go. There was a time when being with Lena was like breathing in fresh air, when her laugh could light up the room and the way she touched him made him feel alive. But those days were long gone. Now, every moment with her felt like standing on a knife's edge. It was exhilarating and terrifying, but mostly, it was exhausting. Nick stood up, his body swaying slightly from the alcohol, and walked to the window. Outside, the city stretched out beneath him, lights flickering like stars, indifferent to his inner turmoil. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, staring out at the night, trying to find some semblance of clarity in the chaos that was his mind. He could hear Lena in the other room, her voice low as she muttered to herself. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew the tone. It was the same one she used when they fought, sharp, venomous, like she was daring him to respond. He didn't have the energy for another fight tonight. Not after the last one. God, why does it always have to be like this? He thought bitterly. Every conversation with her turned into a battle. He didn't know when it had started, but at some point, they had stopped trying to understand each other and started aiming to wound. Every word was a barb, every look was loaded with contempt. Nick sighed and ran a hand through his hair, his fingers brushing against the tension coiled in his skull. He knew he should go out there, try to talk to her, try to fix whatever was broken between them. But what was the point? They had done this dance too many times. He knew how it would end, more yelling, more blame, and no real answers. And tomorrow, they'd pretend everything was fine until the next explosion. Lena's voice cut through the silence, louder this time. "You're just going to sit in there and drink all night? Is that your solution to everything now?" Nick didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the skyline, the glass fogging with his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, and he clenched his jaw, willing himself not to respond, not to give in to the bait. "Nick," she snapped, her voice growing sharper. "I'm talking to you." He closed his eyes, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He could feel the familiar anger bubbling up inside him, the fire that always seemed to burn hotter the more she pushed. "Don't," he muttered barely loud enough for her to hear. "Just don't." "Don't what?" Lena's voice was closer now, and he could hear the disdain dripping from every word. "Don't call you out on your bullshit? Don't expect you to actually talk to me instead of drowning in that bottle?" Nick gritted his teeth, the muscles in his neck tensing. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to lash out. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. This was how it always went. She'd needle him until he snapped, and then they'd both say things they couldn't take back. "I can't do this right now," he said finally, his voice low and strained. Lena let out a bitter laugh. "Of course you can't. You never can, Nick. You just run away. Every fucking time." Her words hit him like a slap, and he felt the familiar sting of guilt mixing with his anger. She wasn't wrong. He did run. He hid in his drinks, in his silence, in his own head, because facing her, facing them, was too much. He turned around slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face a mask of frustration and disappointment. God, she looked so different from the woman he had fallen in love with. "Why are you still here, Lena?" Nick asked quietly, his voice devoid of the heat she expected. "Why do we keep doing this?" For a moment, Lena's expression faltered. She looked away, biting her lip, and for a brief second, Nick saw a flicker of the girl she used to be, the girl who had once made him feel like he could conquer the world. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, hard exterior she wore so well. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I don't know why we keep hurting each other." Nick's chest tightened at her words. He didn't know either. All he knew was that they were trapped, caught in a cycle they couldn't break. Every fight brought them closer to the edge, but neither of them was willing to take the final step and end it. "I want you out of my head," Nick whispered, more to himself than to her. "I want you out of my life, but I can't. I can't let go." Lena stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if she was trying to find some sign of the man she had once loved. But whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. She turned away, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Maybe we're both too far gone." Nick watched her walk away, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. Too far gone. Maybe they were. And maybe it was only a matter of time before they both fell over the edge. He downed the rest of his drink in one long, burning gulp, the alcohol offering no comfort, only the numbness he so desperately craved. But even that wouldn't last. Nothing ever did. Episode 2, The Edge of Madness. Nick woke with the familiar pounding in his skull, the aftermath of another night drowned in whiskey and bad decisions. The room spun as he blinked his eyes open, the dull light of early morning creeping through the blinds. His mouth was dry, his throat raw, and his body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry on the sidewalk. He could still taste the bitterness of last night's argument, even though most of the details had blurred into a haze of anger and regret. He groaned, pushing himself up from the bed. His head swam as the pounding increased, his brain punishing him for the night before. There was an empty bottle on the nightstand, 80 proof whiskey, his new best friend. His fingertips brushed the edge of the bottle, remembering the burn of each shot, each one like a nail hammered into the coffin of his relationship. Lena wasn't there. The space next to him was empty, sheets cold and untouched. She hadn't come to bed, not after the fight. Nick couldn't even remember what the argument had been about, only that it had escalated quickly, spiraling out of control like it always did. Voices raised, words spat like venom, hitting their marks with perfect precision. That's how it always was with them now, an endless game of emotional warfare. He staggered to his feet, bracing himself against the wall as his vision swam. The world felt tilted, like he was walking through a dream that he couldn't wake up from. He was still in the same nightmare, too stubborn to let go, too angry to make it work. "We're both acting insane," he thought bitterly. "But neither of us is willing to change." He grabbed a cigarette from the pack on the dresser and lit it with shaky hands. The first drag was sharp, filling his lungs with the harshness he craved. It was the only thing that seemed to steady his nerves, if only for a moment. He stood by the window, staring out at the city as the cigarette burned between his fingers. The sky was overcast, gray clouds rolling in like a reflection of the storm inside his head. As he exhaled, he tried to piece together what had happened last night. Lena had come home late, something she'd been doing more often lately. There was always an excuse, always a reason that didn't quite add up. He knew she was pulling away, distancing herself from him, but he couldn't figure out how to stop it. Or if he even wanted to. "I need something to change," she had said, her voice tired and heavy. "We can't keep going like this, Nick. We're tearing each other apart." Nick had scoffed, taking another swig of whiskey, feeling the burn slide down his throat. "You think I don't know that? You think I like this? What do you want me to do, Lena? I'm trying, but you're always pushing me, always fucking with me." "You're trying?" She had spat, her eyes flashing with anger. "Is that what this is? You call this trying?" Drinking yourself into a stupor every night, shutting me out, refusing to even talk to me? That's your idea of trying? Nick had slammed the bottle down on the table, the force of it making the glass rattle. Don't tell me what the fuck I'm doing wrong. You're not some innocent victim in all of this, Lena. You're the one who's checked out, who's running around, staying out late, acting like this is all on me. You want change? You first. The memory of her face, twisted in anger and hurt, made Nick's chest tighten. He didn't want to think about it anymore. He didn't want to feel the guilt that was gnawing at him from the inside, the guilt he tried to drown with alcohol but never could. He took another drag of the cigarette, staring at the smoke as it curled upward, disappearing into the stale air of the room. His fingers were stained yellow, a testament to how often he smoked now, each drag like a countdown to his own self-destruction. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Lena stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She had dark circles under her eyes, her hair a mess, and she looked like she hadn't slept at all. For a moment, their eyes met, and there was something raw in her gaze, something broken. "You're up," she said, her voice flat. Nick shrugged, exhaling another plume of smoke. "Yeah." Lena crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Do you even remember what we fought about?" "Not really," Nick muttered, flicking ash into the tray by the window. "Does it matter? It's always the same shit anyway." She sighed, rubbing her temples like she was trying to stave off a headache. "Nick, we can't keep doing this. We're killing each other. Every fight, every fucking argument, it's too much. You think I don't know that?" He snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "You think I want this? I hate it, Lena. I fucking hate what we've become." Lena's shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked defeated. "So what do we do? Because I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if we can fix this." Nick crushed the cigarette in the ashtray, the embers snuffing out with a hiss. He felt the familiar anger bubbling up again, the frustration of being trapped in a situation he didn't know how to escape. "I don't fucking know," he growled. "I don't know what you want from me. One minute, you're telling me you need something to change, the next, you're acting like this is all my fault. I never said it was all your fault." Lena shot back, her voice rising. "But you're not helping, Nick. You're drinking yourself into oblivion every night, you're shutting me out, and I'm losing my mind trying to figure out how to reach you." Nick laughed bitterly, running a hand through his messy hair. "Reach me? Is that what you're trying to do? Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you're just waiting for an excuse to leave." Lena flinched, her eyes narrowing. "You really think that? Don't you?" Nick challenged, stepping closer to her, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you fucking dare lie to me, Lena. You've got one foot out the door. I can see it. I can feel it. So don't stand there and act like I'm the only one pushing us to the edge." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Nick thought she was going to slap him. He almost wished she would. It would be easier than the silence that stretched between them now, thick with all the things they didn't want to say. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to leave, Nick. But I can't stay like this." Nick's throat tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could find a way back to what they used to be. But the truth was, they were already too far gone. "I need a drink," he muttered, brushing past her and heading for the kitchen. Lena didn't try to stop him. She just watched him go, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any of their fights. Nick grabbed a bottle from the counter, twisting off the cap and taking a long swig. The burn was familiar, comforting. It numbed the edges of his thoughts, dulling the pain that clawed at his insides. But as he stood there, the bottle in his hand, Nick realized something. No matter how much he drank, no matter how hard he tried to drown it all out, the pain never really went away. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for him to sober up and face it. And that terrified him more than anything. He took another drink, hoping it would be enough to keep the madness at bay for just a little while longer. But deep down, he knew that he was teetering on the edge, and it was only a matter of time before he fell. Episode 3. Caught in the Flames. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the wreckage of the apartment. Nick sat on the couch, staring blankly at the mess surrounding him, an overturned chair, a shattered glass on the floor, and the whiskey bottle lying on its side, its contents long since drained. His head throbbed, the hangover a familiar weight pressing down on him, but it was nothing compared to the heaviness in his chest. He hadn't slept. After last night's argument, he had spent hours nursing his drink, staring at the ceiling as memories of Lena haunted him. Every word she had said was like a wound that wouldn't heal, each one deepening the rift between them. But despite the chaos they created together, he couldn't shake the feeling that he still needed her. Nick looked at the empty space beside him on the couch, imagining her sitting there, her legs tucked under her, eyes flicking from him to the TV, as if she were trying to avoid the inevitable confrontation. There had been a time when just being in the same room as her was enough to make him feel alive, but now, everything felt different. Every moment they spent together was charged with tension, like the air before a storm. And the storms were frequent. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the stubble on his jaw. He was tired, physically, emotionally, spiritually drained. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. But the thought of losing Lena entirely felt like stepping into an abyss. The fear of being alone, of facing the emptiness she'd leave behind, was worse than the fights. It was worse than the pain. He stood up slowly, his body protesting the movement, and walked to the window. The city was alive outside, people going about their business, completely unaware of the quiet destruction happening in his world. Nick envied them. He envied the simplicity of their lives, the way they could just exist. For him, everything felt like a battle with himself, a battle with Lena, a battle to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to grasp it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door creaking open. Lena. She stepped inside, looking as exhausted as he felt. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore the same clothes from yesterday. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her lips were pressed into a tight line. She glanced around the room, taking in the mess, but said nothing. Nick watched her carefully, unsure of how to start. He felt like he should say something, anything, to cut through the thick silence that settled between them. But words felt useless. Every time they talked, it just made things worse. Lena crossed the room, moving with a weary grace, and sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't look at him, just stared down at her hands, her fingers tracing the outline of a cigarette burn on the table's surface. Nick realized, with a jolt, that he had caused that burn during one of their many late-night arguments. He had been too drunk to care at the time, but now it stood as a small, ugly reminder of everything that had gone wrong between them. Finally, Lena broke the silence. "I'm exhausted, Nick." Her voice was quiet, but there was a hardness to it that made Nick's stomach twist. He could hear the weight of everything unsaid in those 4 words. She wasn't just talking about being tired. She was talking about them. "I know," he muttered, not sure what else to say. He didn't have the energy for another fight, but he could feel it building, like a storm on the horizon. Lena let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Do you really know? Because every time I try to talk to you, you just shut down. Or you drink until you can't even form a coherent sentence. And then we just, what? Ignore it until the next explosion?" Nick clenched his fists, trying to keep his temper in check. "It's not that simple, Lena. Isn't it?" she shot back, her voice sharp. "You think I don't see what's happening? You think I don't know you're drowning yourself in booze because it's easier than facing the truth? You're not even here anymore, Nick. You're just gone." Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. She was right. He was gone. Or at least, a part of him was. The part that used to feel things, the part that used to care. He had buried that part of himself under layers of alcohol and anger, trying to numb the pain, but it wasn't working anymore. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "That I'm fucked up? That I don't know how to fix this? Because I don't, Lena. I don't know how to fix us. Lena's eyes flashed with frustration, and she stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back so hard it nearly toppled over. Maybe we're not fixable, she said, her voice cracking at the edges. Maybe we've broken each other too much. Nick felt his chest tighten at her words, but he couldn't bring himself to argue. He had been thinking the same thing for weeks, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. Too real. So what? Nick asked, bitterness creeping into his tone. You're just going to walk away? After everything? Lena's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in a long time, she looked defeated. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know what we're doing. Nick stared at her, the anger bubbling up inside him once more, but it wasn't directed at her. It was aimed at himself, at the situation, at the fact that they had let things get this bad. He wanted to scream, to smash something, to do anything that would release the pressure building inside him. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for the bottle of whiskey on the counter and poured himself another drink, even though he knew it wouldn't help. It never did. Lena watched him, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything as he took a long swig, the liquid burning its way down his throat. The silence between them felt like a noose tightening around his neck, and for a brief moment, Nick wondered if this was it, if this was the moment they both finally admitted defeat. I gave you everything, Nick, Lena said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. I gave you my heart, my soul, and I don't even recognize myself anymore. I don't know who I am without you, but I can't keep losing myself like this. Nick closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He knew she was right. They had both given too much, taken too much, until there was nothing left. But the thought of losing her, of truly letting her go, was more than he could handle. I don't want to lose you, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Lena didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut him deeper than any of their fights ever had. We've already lost each other, Nick, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We just don't want to admit it. Nick felt the truth of her words sink into his bones, but he didn't know how to respond. Instead, he took another drink, the familiar warmth of the alcohol spreading through him, dulling the pain just enough to keep him from breaking down entirely. But even as he drank, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The flames were already burning them both alive, and there was no way to put them out. Not anymore. Episode 4. Slicing through the veil. Nick sat alone at the kitchen table, the whiskey bottle in front of him, casting long shadows in the dim light of the overhead lamp. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that hung like a heavy fog, thick with things unsaid. Lena had stormed out hours ago, slamming the door behind her. She was good at that, leaving when the tension got too thick, letting the echoes of her anger linger in the empty spaces she left behind. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers brushing the edges of his scalp. He could still hear her voice, her words like knives slicing through him, precise and sharp. Asterisk. We're not fixable. Asterisk. Her words had been haunting him since she'd spoken them, and now, in the stillness of the night, they echoed louder than ever. Nick poured another drink, watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass. His hands were steadier than before, but only because he was growing numb. That was what he wanted, the numbness. It was better than the pain, better than the reality of everything falling apart around him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could take this, living in the wreckage of what their relationship had become. He wanted to cut through it all, to slice through the tension, the lies, the bullshit, and find something real again. But there was nothing left to cut through. It was all gone, reduced to ashes and broken glass, like the fragments of the whiskey bottle they'd shattered last week in yet another argument. He laughed bitterly, thinking about how ridiculous it all was. They couldn't even have a proper fight anymore without breaking something, be it a glass, a table, or a part of themselves. The TV was on in the background, a boxing match playing out on the screen. Nick wasn't paying attention, but the sounds of fists hitting flesh and the roar of the crowd provided a strange comfort. Violence, raw, primal, and unfiltered. It was something he understood. Something that made sense. Lena hated the fights. She always complained about the noise, about how he'd get lost in the spectacle, completely absorbed by it. But to Nick, the fights were a way to escape. He envied the fighters, the simplicity of their world. Two men in a ring, nothing but fists and determination. No complications, no tangled emotions, just raw conflict and resolution. Someone won, and someone lost. Clean. Simple. He looked at the glass in his hand, the light catching on the whiskey, making it glint like gold. He imagined smashing it against the wall, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces. It wouldn't solve anything, but at least it would feel like something. It would be better than this emptiness gnawing at his insides, the void Lena had left behind when she walked out the door. His thoughts drifted back to her. He could picture her perfectly in his mind, the way her eyes would narrow when she was angry, the way her lips would tremble when she was on the verge of saying something she couldn't take back. They'd been here before, countless times, circling the same arguments, replaying the same drama like a broken record. Nick gripped the glass tighter, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the way she made him feel. He wasn't proud of it, but the thought was there, lurking in the back of his mind like a dark shadow. He wanted to cut through her defenses, to expose the vulnerability beneath, to remind her that she wasn't as strong as she pretended to be. He slammed the glass down on the table, the sound echoing in the empty room. "Fuck," he muttered under his breath. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep letting his thoughts spiral like this, letting the anger fester until it consumed him. Lena had always accused him of being possessive, of wanting too much control. Maybe she was right. Maybe his need to have her, to hold on to her, no matter the cost, was the root of their problems. But it wasn't just about control. It was about wanting something real. He wanted her to be the person she used to be, the one who loved him without reservation, without the bitterness and the constant fighting. But that person was gone, and maybe she had been for a long time. Maybe they both had. The door creaked open, and Nick's head snapped up. Lena stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of everything between them. Her eyes flicked to him, then to the glass on the table, and he saw the flash of disappointment in her gaze. "Drinking again?" she asked, her voice flat. Nick shrugged. "What else is there to do?" Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. She walked over to the couch and sat down, her body slumped as if she could barely hold herself up. Nick watched her, the familiar mix of anger and longing twisting in his chest. He wanted to reach out to her, to pull her close, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. They were past that now. She glanced at the TV, her brows furrowing. "You're watching that again?" Nick didn't answer. He didn't want to get into another fight about something as stupid as the TV. But he could feel the tension building between them again, the same tension that always led to another explosion. Lena leaned back on the couch, closing her eyes. "We can't keep doing this, Nick. We're killing each other." "I know," he muttered, his voice low. She opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze piercing. "Then why won't you stop? Why won't you let this go?" Nick clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. "Because I don't know how. I don't know how to stop wanting you, even though I know we're fucking each other up." Lena didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Nick's chest tighten. "I don't know how to stop either," she admitted quietly. "But this, whatever this is, it's not love anymore, Nick. It's something else. Something dark." Nick swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew she was right. What they had now wasn't love. It was obsession. It was possession. It was a twisted, ugly thing that had once been beautiful, but now only caused them pain. "I want to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't." Lena shook her head, standing up from the couch. She walked over to the window, looking out at the dark city below. "You're not the only one who feels that way," she said softly. But we can't keep doing this to each other. We'll destroy ourselves. Nick stood up, walking over to her. He wanted to reach out, to pull her into his arms, but something held him back. He could see the weariness in her, the same weariness he felt in himself. They were both exhausted, exhausted from fighting, exhausted from trying, exhausted from pretending that this could ever work. I don't know what to do, Nick admitted, his voice raw with emotion. Lena turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Neither do I, she said quietly. But we can't keep slicing each other open like this. It's killing us, Nick. Nick felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced it down. He didn't want to break down in front of her. Not now. Not after everything. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end, that they had finally reached the point where there was no turning back. Lena looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. I'm going to bed, she said softly. You should too. Episode 5. Flood the garage, flood my mind. Nick's mind was a blur as he sat in the driver's seat of his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The garage door was closed, trapping him in this dark, suffocating space. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, but he couldn't bring himself to press down. He just sat there, feeling the engine hum beneath him, the vibrations crawling up his legs, through his body, rattling his bones. The smell of gasoline and motor oil mixed with the faint scent of whiskey on his breath, creating a toxic cloud inside the car. Outside the car window, the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof of the garage, a constant, mindless beat that matched the pounding in his head. It had been pouring for hours, the sky an unbroken sheet of gray. The whole world was drowning, it seemed, and Nick was no exception. Lena had left earlier, after another of their fights. He couldn't even remember what had started at this time. The fights had become so frequent, so predictable, that the details blurred together in his mind like watercolor paint bleeding across the page. All he remembered was the sound of her voice, cold, detached, each word like a slap. She'd said something about needing space, about not being able to breathe around him. It was always the same. And then she was gone, the door slamming behind her, leaving Nick alone with his anger, his guilt, and the oppressive silence that followed. He had gone down to the garage to escape it, to escape the suffocating weight of their apartment, and the ghosts of their arguments. The garage was supposed to be his space, his sanctuary, a place where he could tinker with his car, clear his head. But tonight, it felt more like a tomb, the air thick and heavy with fumes and the lingering tension that still clung to him like a second skin. His eyes flicked to the dashboard. The fuel gauge hovered just below half, and Nick wondered, with a morbid curiosity, how long it would take to run the tank dry if he just sat here with the engine on. Would the fumes fill the garage and choke the life out of him before the gas ran out? Or would he turn off the engine before it came to that, driven by some primal instinct to survive? He laughed bitterly at the thought. He wasn't suicidal. Not really. But there was something about the idea of giving in to the darkness, of letting go completely, that felt almost peaceful. Like finally surrendering after a long, exhausting battle. Nick took a deep breath, the smell of gasoline thick in his nostrils. His mind wandered to Lena again, as it always did. She was his obsession, his addiction, the thing that kept him awake at night and drove him to drink. He knew their relationship was toxic, knew they were tearing each other apart piece by piece, but he couldn't let go. He didn't know how. Too much pleasure is pain, he thought, Kurt's words coming back to him like a ghost from the past. Too much pain is madness. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Was this what madness felt like? This constant push and pull, this endless cycle of wanting and resenting, of loving and hating? He had never been good at goodbyes. Even when he knew it was over, he couldn't bring himself to end it. He and Lena were like two drowning people, clinging to each other as they sank deeper into the abyss, unable to let go, even though they were dragging each other down. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the sharp pain shooting up his arm a welcome distraction from the storm inside his head. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep drowning in his own misery, his own rage. He needed an escape, a release, something to tear him away from the endless loop of their destruction. Without thinking, Nick shoved the gearshift into drive and floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires squealing as they skidded across the slick concrete floor of the garage. The sound echoed off the walls, deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, Nick felt a surge of adrenaline, a brief flash of clarity in the chaos. But it didn't last. The car slammed into the back wall of the garage with a sickening crunch, the front bumper crumpling like tin foil. Nick sat there, his heart racing, the smell of burning rubber and gasoline filling the air. His chest heaved with each breath, the crash leaving him dazed, but not broken. Not yet. He wanted to feel something, anything, but all that remained was the numbness, the same hollow emptiness that had been gnawing at him for weeks. He killed the engine and sat in the silence, staring at the cracked concrete wall in front of him. His pulse gradually slowed, the rush of adrenaline fading, leaving him cold and exhausted. The rain outside continued its relentless downpour, the sound of it against the garage roof a constant reminder that the world was still spinning, still moving forward, even as Nick's life remained stuck in the same miserable loop. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the sudden vibration snapping him out of his daze. He pulled it out, expecting another message from Lena, another angry text, another cutting remark. But when he unlocked the screen, it wasn't from her. It was a notification from the bank, insufficient funds. He stared at the message, his mind struggling to process what it meant. He had been so caught up in his downward spiral with Lena that he hadn't even noticed the money slipping through his fingers. He had been hemorrhaging cash on booze, repairs, and whatever distraction he could throw himself into to escape the reality of his crumbling life. Now, it seemed, the consequences were finally catching up with him. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat with a snarl, running his hands through his hair. He couldn't afford to keep living like this, couldn't afford to keep wrecking his life, his car, his relationship. But the weight of it all, the fights with Lena, the guilt, the shame, felt insurmountable. It was like trying to claw his way out of quicksand. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. Nick climbed out of the car, his legs unsteady as he made his way to the workbench at the back of the garage. Tools were scattered everywhere, remnants of his half-hearted attempts to fix the things that were broken in his life. He picked up a wrench, turning it over in his hand, feeling the cold metal bite into his palm. For a moment, he considered smashing it into the windshield of the car, destroying it completely. But the futility of the act stopped him. Breaking things wouldn't solve anything. It never did. Instead, he threw the wrench down with a clatter and leaned against the workbench, his head hanging low, the rain still pounding outside. He thought of Lena, wherever she was, probably sitting in her car, just as lost as he was. He thought about the way she looked at him now, with disappointment, with resentment, as if he were a burden she could no longer bear. And maybe he was. He wanted to hate her for it, but he couldn't. Because the truth was, he felt the same way about himself. The garage felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. The fumes still lingered in the air, thick and choking, but Nick didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the ground, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. We're drowning, he thought, his mind spiraling once again. And neither of us knows how to swim. He wondered how much longer they could keep doing this. How much longer they could keep hurting each other before one of them finally gave up. Before one of them finally let go. Episode 6. The Endless Night. Nick sat on the couch, the apartment cloaked in the heavy, oppressive darkness of late evening. The only light came from the muted glow of the television, casting a flickering blue across the room. He wasn't watching it, hadn't even bothered to change the channel since Lena stormed out earlier that day. It was just noise, static in the background, a thin barrier between him and the silence that gnawed at his insides. The whiskey bottle sat in front of him, taunting him like it always did. He'd lost count of how many drinks he'd had, but it didn't matter. Drinking had become less about the alcohol and more about the routine, the familiar ritual of numbing himself to the relentless chaos of his life. Lena was gone. Again. She'd left without saying much, Just a few bitter words, the usual cold stare, and a quick slam of the door. There was no finality to it. She never said she was leaving for good, never threatened to break up or walk away forever. It was like they both knew that the door would swing back open soon enough and they'd fall back into the same cycle, fighting, making up, pretending things were better, only to crash again. The repetition was sickening, but Nick had no idea how to break the pattern. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his haze. It was probably Lena, sending him another angry text, but when he glanced at the screen, it wasn't her. Unknown number. Nick hesitated for a moment before swiping the notification away. He couldn't deal with anyone else right now. He was barely holding himself together as it was. His mind was still spinning from the argument earlier, his emotions teetering between anger, sadness, and a cold, hollow numbness that seemed to be the only thing keeping him from completely unraveling. His thoughts drifted back to Lena. She was probably at some bar, drinking just as much as he was, numbing herself in her own way. That's what she always did, run away when things got too heavy, when the weight of their problems became too much to carry. She'd disappear for a few hours, maybe even a night, and come back acting like nothing had happened. Like they could just pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. Nick downed another shot of whiskey, letting the burn trail down his throat. It was a temporary escape, one that was becoming less and less effective as time went on. The alcohol dulled the edges of his pain, but it never erased it completely. The moment the buzz faded, the same heavy emptiness would come rushing back, drowning him in a wave of regret and hopelessness. He reached for the bottle again, but before he could pour another drink, his phone buzzed once more. He groaned, leaning forward to check it. This time, the message was from Lena. "I need space. Don't wait up." The words cut through him, sharper than he expected. Space. It was always space. It had become Lena's go-to excuse, her way of pulling away without really leaving. But Nick knew better by now. She wasn't just asking for space, she was pulling further and further away from him, from their relationship. And he had no idea how to stop it. He stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. Don't wait up. The implication was clear, she wasn't coming back tonight. Maybe not even tomorrow. Nick tossed the phone aside and leaned back on the couch, rubbing his temples. His head throbbed, a dull ache that had nothing to do with the whiskey and everything to do with the emotional spiral he was stuck in. The nights like this had become more frequent lately, Lena leaving, him staying behind, drinking alone until the early hours of the morning, trying to convince himself that things would somehow get better. But deep down, he knew they wouldn't. They were both running on fumes, too stubborn to admit it was over, too scared to face the emptiness that would come with truly letting go. Nick closed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. He hadn't slept in what felt like days, but every time he closed his eyes, his mind wouldn't shut off. It raced, looping back to every fight, every harsh word, every mistake they had made along the way. It was like a highlight reel of their worst moments, playing on repeat in his head, and no matter how much he drank, he couldn't escape it. Why do we keep doing this? Nick asked himself for what felt like the 100th time. They were killing each other slowly, piece by piece, with every fight, every accusation, every cold silence. And yet, he couldn't let her go. He couldn't imagine his life without her, even though he knew that being with her was tearing him apart. The rain outside had started again, tapping against the windows in a steady, relentless rhythm. Nick listened to it, letting the sound fill the empty spaces in his mind. The rain had always calmed him, even as a kid. There was something soothing about it, something constant in the midst of everything else falling apart. He thought about what Lena had said before she left. I can't breathe around you. The words had stung, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. They were suffocating each other, both of them gasping for air, but too entangled in their toxic dance to step back and give the other room to breathe. Nick took another sip of whiskey, letting it sit on his tongue before swallowing. He didn't know what to do anymore. He didn't know how to fix them, didn't even know if they could be fixed. Every fight felt like another crack in the foundation, and eventually, the whole thing would come crashing down. Maybe it already had, and they were just standing in the rubble, pretending they could still build something out of the ruins. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, expecting another message from Lena, but it wasn't her this time. Missed call, unknown number. Nick frowned, his foggy brain trying to make sense of it. He didn't usually get calls from unknown numbers, especially not this late at night. His mind drifted to Lena again, wondering if she was with someone else, if she was already moving on while he sat here drowning himself in whiskey and regret. The thought sent a wave of bitterness crashing through him, but he pushed it aside. There was no point in letting his mind spiral into that dark place again. Instead, he stood up, the room swaying slightly as he got to his feet. The alcohol had finally caught up to him, making everything feel distant, like he was moving through a thick fog. He needed air. He needed to get out of this suffocating apartment, away from the memories that clung to every corner like shadows. Nick grabbed his jacket and stumbled toward the door, his legs unsteady beneath him. The rain was still coming down in sheets as he stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He stood on the balcony, looking out over the city, the lights blurred by the rain. Everything felt surreal, like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Maybe this is it, he thought, the realization sinking in like a stone in his chest. Maybe this is all there is. The thought chilled him to the bone. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that this was how his life would play out, endless nights of fighting, drinking, and waiting for someone who would never come back. But as he stood there, the rain soaking through his clothes, the cold seeping into his bones, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too far gone. He was trapped in an endless night, and there was no way out. Episode 7. Ride or Die. The tour bus rumbled down the dark highway, the hum of the engine vibrating through Nick's bones as he sat in the back, staring out at the endless stretch of road ahead. The moon was a pale crescent in the sky, casting ghostly shadows over the landscape, but inside the bus, it was warm, almost stifling. The air smelled faintly of leather, sweat, and the stale remnants of a dozen cigarette butts crushed into the ashtray beside him. Lena was up front, sitting on one of the leather couches, her phone in her hand, but she wasn't looking at it. She hadn't said much since they'd left the last city, but that wasn't unusual. Lately, they had both fallen into a rhythm of silence, a fragile truce that neither of them dared to break. It was easier that way. Safer. There were no words left to say that wouldn't reopen old wounds. Nick leaned his head against the window, feeling the cool glass against his forehead. The vibration of the road beneath them was like a heartbeat, steady and constant, a background hum that lulled him into a kind of daze. He should have felt free, being out here on the road, away from the suffocating walls of their apartment, away from the familiar places that held too many memories. But there was no escape. The tension between him and Lena followed them like a storm cloud, always there, just on the edge of erupting. The bus was full of people, musicians, roadies, Lena's friends, but it might as well have been empty. Everyone was locked in their own world, headphones on, faces buried in their phones, lost in the distraction of the moment. It was a surreal feeling, being surrounded by so many people yet feeling completely alone. He glanced over at Lena. She looked as distant as ever, her face illuminated by the dim glow of her phone screen. There was something about the way she held herself now, rigid, like she was trying to keep the world at arm's length. Nick had once known every curve of her body, every expression, every shift in her mood. But now, it was like she had built a wall between them, and he couldn't find a way to break through. They were miles away from their apartment, miles away from the life they had built together, but the distance hadn't changed anything. It hadn't healed the rift between them. If anything, it had made it worse. The road was supposed to be a new beginning, a chance to escape, to leave their problems behind. But wherever they went, their problems followed. The tour was just another bandage over a wound that was too deep to heal. Nick sighed, rubbing his temples as the dull throb of a headache began to creep in. The drinking had been worse lately. The tour was an excuse to indulge, to lose himself in the haze of alcohol and loud music, to forget everything for a while. But even in the midst of it all, the noise, the chaos, there was always the cold, hard truth waiting for him when the buzz wore off. Lena glanced up from her phone and met his eyes. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy with everything they weren't saying. Nick could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her back. She looked as tired as he felt. "Are you okay?" Nick asked, the words sounding hollow even as they left his mouth. It was a stupid question. Of course she wasn't okay. Neither of them was. Lena shrugged, turning her gaze back to her phone. "I'm fine." Nick didn't press her. He knew better by now. Lena didn't talk about her feelings anymore. Not to him, at least. There had been a time when they could talk about anything, when they would stay up all night, lying in bed, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams. But those nights were long gone, buried under layers of resentment and unspoken anger. The bus hit a bump in the road, jolting them both. Nick reached for the bottle of whiskey at his feet, unscrewing the cap with a practiced motion. The familiar burn slid down his throat, warm and comforting. He offered the bottle to Lena, but she shook her head. "I'm good," she muttered, barely glancing at him. Nick frowned, setting the bottle down. "You sure? You've barely had anything tonight." "I said I'm good," Lena snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Nick bit back a retort, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't want to start another fight, not here, not now. But it was hard. The tension between them was like a live wire, crackling just beneath the surface, ready to spark at any moment. Lena sighed, rubbing her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer now. "I didn't mean to snap." Nick waved it off, leaning back in his seat. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. The bus rumbled on, the sound of the engine and the steady hum of the tires on asphalt filling the silence. Nick closed his eyes, trying to shut out the world, trying to find some semblance of peace. But even with his eyes closed, he could feel Lena's presence beside him, like a weight pressing down on his chest. They had become strangers in their own relationship. Two people sharing the same space, but worlds apart. The tour had been Lena's idea, a way to escape the suffocating routine of their life back home. She had said it would be good for them, that they needed to get away, to clear their heads. But Nick knew it wasn't about clearing their heads. It was about running. Running from each other, from their problems, from the inevitable truth that they were both too afraid to face. Nick opened his eyes, staring at the road ahead. The highway stretched on into the darkness, endless and unforgiving. It felt like a metaphor for their relationship, always moving forward, but never getting anywhere. Just a long, winding road with no destination in sight. He glanced over at Lena again. She was staring out the window now, her face illuminated by the passing headlights. She looked so far away, like she was already gone, even though she was sitting right beside him. "Lena," Nick said, his voice low. She turned to him, her eyes tired and distant. "We can't keep doing this," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine. We're running away from each other, and it's killing us." Lena didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Nick thought she might say something, might finally open up, but then she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know what you want me to say, Nick," she said quietly. "I don't know what to do anymore." Nick's chest tightened at her words, the frustration and helplessness clawing at him. He wanted to fix it, wanted to fix them, but he didn't know how. They were trapped in this cycle, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way out. "I just want us to be okay again," he muttered, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even him. Lena closed her eyes, leaning her head against the window. "I don't think we can be, Nick. I think we're too far gone." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't argue. He didn't have the energy to. The road stretched on, endless and empty, And Nick wondered how long they could keep riding before everything finally fell apart. Episode 8. The Final Break. Nick sat in the tour bus, the hum of the engine fading into the background as the landscape blurred outside the window. The night was dark, almost unnaturally so, as if the world had swallowed the stars and left nothing but an empty, black void. The road stretched on ahead, but for Nick, it felt like it was leading nowhere. He stared at the window, watching the trees and occasional flashes of light from distant farmhouses slip past, but his mind was somewhere else, stuck on the same thoughts that had haunted him for months. Lena was sitting across from him, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs. She was scrolling through her phone, but her eyes weren't really focused on the screen. She was just going through the motions, like she had been for weeks now. Nick had tried to talk to her earlier, tried to bridge the gap between them, but her answers had been curt, her tone distant. He couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation. Every interaction felt like they were skirting around the inevitable end, both too afraid to say what they knew had to be said. But the silence between them had grown too loud to ignore. It was suffocating, a weight pressing down on his chest every time he looked at her. Nick took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been avoiding this moment for so long, clinging to the hope that things might somehow get better. But they weren't getting better. They were only getting worse. The tour had been an escape, a chance to run away from the cracks in their relationship, but all it had done was magnify them. Out here on the road, there was no hiding from the truth. And the truth was, they were broken. Maybe beyond repair. "Lena," Nick said, his voice cutting through the soft rumble of the bus. She didn't look up from her phone at first, but after a moment, she sighed and set it down on the table beside her. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that Nick recognized all too well. They were both exhausted from fighting, from pretending, from trying to hold on to something that had long since slipped through their fingers. "What is it, Nick?" she asked, her voice flat. Nick hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He had run through this conversation 1,000 times in his head, but now that the moment was here, the words seemed to stick in his throat. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Lena raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "About what?" Nick rubbed the back of his neck, trying to find the right words. He didn't want to hurt her, didn't want to make this harder than it already was, but there was no easy way to do this. They had been dragging it out for too long, and the longer they waited, the more painful it became. "About us," Nick said, meeting her gaze. Lena's expression didn't change, but Nick saw the flicker of something in her eyes, something guarded, something that told him she had been expecting this conversation for a long time. Maybe she had been waiting for him to be the one to say it. Maybe she had been too tired to do it herself. "What about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had been here before, on the edge of saying what needed to be said, but every time, he had pulled back, afraid of the finality of it. Afraid of what would come after. But he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't keep living in this purgatory, trapped between love and hate, between longing and resentment. "We're not okay, Lena," Nick said, his voice soft but steady. "We haven't been okay for a long time." Lena looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. She didn't say anything, but Nick could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her body stiffened at his words. He knew she felt it too. She had to. They were both living in the same broken reality, both pretending that things might somehow fix themselves, but deep down, they knew the truth. "I know," Lena said finally, her voice barely audible. "I know we're not." Nick's chest tightened at her admission. Part of him had hoped that she would argue, that she would fight for them, but another part of him, maybe the larger part, knew that this was the only way it could end. They were too far gone, and nothing either of them did could change that. "We're just hurting each other," Nick continued, his voice faltering slightly. Every day, every fight, it's like we're chipping away at whatever's left of us. And I don't know how to stop it. Lena's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, Nick saw a flash of the vulnerability she had been hiding for so long. Her walls had been up for months, maybe even years, but now, for the first time in a long time, she looked raw. Exposed. I don't know how to stop it either, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know how to fix us. Nick swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had known this was coming, had felt it building for weeks, months even, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way he hadn't been ready for. There was no going back now. No more pretending. No more holding on to something that was already gone. I think we need to let go, Nick said, his voice breaking slightly. Lena's eyes widened, and for a moment, Nick thought she might protest, that she might try to salvage what was left of their relationship. But instead, she just stared at him, her expression blank, as if she was trying to process the weight of his words. Let go, she repeated, her voice hollow. Nick nodded, his heart aching. Yeah. I think we both know it's over. We're just too scared to admit it. Lena blinked, and Nick saw tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had always been the stronger one, the one who kept her emotions in check, even when everything around them was falling apart. But now, even she seemed on the verge of breaking. You're right, Lena said quietly, her voice cracking. We can't keep doing this. We're just making it worse. Nick felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when everything they had built together, the love, the memories, the future they had once dreamed of, came crashing down around them. I don't want to hurt you anymore, Nick said, his voice raw. I don't want us to hate each other. Lena nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't want that either. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. There were no more words to say. No more arguments to be had. All that was left was the quiet acceptance of the inevitable. Nick stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as he looked down at Lena. She was still sitting on the couch, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked small, fragile, in a way Nick had never seen her before. I'm sorry, Nick said softly. Lena looked up at him, her eyes red and puffy, but she managed a small, sad smile. Me too. Nick turned and walked to the door, the cold night air hitting him as he stepped outside. The tour bus was parked on the side of a deserted road, the landscape stretching out endlessly in front of him. He stood there for a moment, staring out at the dark horizon, feeling the finality of the moment settle over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't look back. Episode 9. Goodbye, goodbye. The hotel room was quiet, the kind of silence that hung heavy in the air, weighing down everything inside. Nick sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint glow of the city lights seeping through the curtains. The room was dimly lit by the soft orange hue of the bedside lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. It was a small, sterile room, just another stop on the road, another temporary place to hide from the inevitable. Lena had left hours ago. They hadn't said much after the conversation on the tour bus. There had been nothing left to say. When they finally arrived at the hotel, she had gathered her things quietly, without a word, and walked out of the room. Nick hadn't stopped her. He hadn't even tried. He had just watched as she slipped out of his life, the final goodbye hanging between them like a thick, suffocating fog. Now, sitting alone in the stillness, Nick felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The truth was undeniable. It was over. There was no coming back from this. They had both known it for a long time, but tonight had been the moment of realization. The moment when they finally stopped pretending. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the nightstand, the glass already half full. It had become a ritual by now. Drink until the pain dulled, drink until the memories blurred, drink until he could pretend that the world outside didn't exist. But tonight, even the whiskey wasn't enough to numb the ache in his chest. He took a long sip, feeling the burn as it slid down his throat. The familiar warmth spread through his body, but it didn't bring the relief he sought. Instead, it only deepened the sense of loss that had been gnawing at him for weeks, months even. Nick set the glass down and ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tugging at the roots as if he could pull the thoughts from his mind. He was trying to remember the exact moment things had fallen apart. There had been so many fights, so many nights spent in silence, so many apologies that never seemed to stick. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, knowing the impact was coming, but powerless to stop it. Maybe it had been doomed from the start. Maybe they had been too different, too stubborn, too unwilling to bend for each other. Or maybe they had just loved each other too hard, too intensely, burning themselves out in the process. Nick picked up his phone from the nightstand and stared at the empty screen. No messages. No calls. He had been waiting for her to text for something, anything, that would tell him she hadn't really walked away. But there was nothing. Just the cold, hollow silence. He knew she wouldn't reach out. Not this time. The way she had looked at him before leaving the bus, her eyes filled with exhaustion, with resignation, had told him everything he needed to know. She was done. Truly done. And there was nothing he could say or do to change that. The truth was he was done too. Or at least, he had to be. There was no point in trying to salvage what was already gone. He couldn't fix them. He couldn't fix her. Hell, he couldn't even fix himself. They were broken beyond repair, and the longer they held on, the more they hurt each other. Nick rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar sting of exhaustion. He hadn't slept in days, not really. Even when he managed to drift off, his dreams were plagued by memories of Lena, of their fights, of the way things used to be. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, heard her voice, felt the ache of knowing that he had lost her long before she had physically left. He reached for his pack of cigarettes on the table, pulling one out and lighting it with a flick of his lighter. The first drag was harsh, the smoke filling his lungs with a bitter satisfaction. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl up toward the ceiling, dissipating into the air. It felt symbolic, in a way, just another thing fading into nothingness. The memories of Lena were still fresh, raw in his mind. He could still picture her sitting across from him on the bus, her eyes tired and distant, her body curled up as if she was trying to protect herself from the world around her. He could still hear her voice, quiet, resigned, as she admitted that they were too far gone. That they couldn't fix what was broken. Nick took another drag of the cigarette, his thoughts swirling in the haze of smoke and alcohol. He didn't want to think about her anymore. He didn't want to remember the way she had looked at him with that mixture of sadness and acceptance, like she had finally given up. But the memories clung to him, refusing to let go. He had always been bad at goodbyes. Even as a kid, he had hated saying farewell, to friends, to family, to anything that mattered. It had always felt too final, too absolute. And now, facing the reality of losing Lena for good, he realized that he had never really learned how to let go. The sound of the door opening broke through his thoughts, and Nick's heart leapt in his chest. For a brief moment, he thought it might be Lena, that she had come back, that maybe she had changed her mind. But when he looked up, it wasn't her. It was just one of the roadies, a young guy named Josh, stepping into the room with a stack of gear. "Hey man," Josh said, his voice casual, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "Just grabbing the last of the stuff. We're heading out soon." Nick nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah. Sure. Go ahead." Josh glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the bottle of whiskey and the half-finished cigarette in Nick's hand. He didn't say anything, but there was a look of quiet understanding in his eyes. He knew. Everyone on the tour knew. It was impossible to miss the cracks in Nick and Lena's relationship, cracks that had widened into a chasm over the past few weeks. "You good?" Josh asked, his voice softer now. Nick took a final drag of the cigarette before stubbing it out in the ashtray. "Yeah. I'm good." Josh nodded, giving Nick a sympathetic smile before grabbing the gear and slipping out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Nick alone once again in the suffocating quiet. Nick stared at the door for a long moment, his chest tight, his mind spinning. He wasn't good. He wasn't even close to good. But he didn't know how to be anything else right now. The whiskey wasn't helping. The cigarettes weren't helping. Nothing was helping. He leaned back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to block out the thoughts that kept creeping in. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something important, something that he could never get back. Nick's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and his heart skipped a beat. He reached for it, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the screen. But it wasn't Lena. It was just a notification from his bank, another reminder that life was moving forward without him, whether he liked it or not. He dropped the phone back on the nightstand, his body sagging with the weight of it all. It was over. Really over. Lena wasn't coming back. There was no last-minute reconciliation, no grand gesture to save them. There was just the cold, empty reality of goodbye. Nick closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over him. He was too tired to fight anymore, too tired to hold on. All he could do now was let go. Goodbye, he whispered to the empty room, the word hanging in the air like a final, silent prayer. Episode 10. The spiral continues. Nick hadn't left the hotel room in days. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the world beyond, casting the room in perpetual twilight. The mess around him had become a landscape of empty bottles, half-smoked cigarettes, and crumpled clothing. His phone lay on the bedside table, untouched for hours, a graveyard of missed calls and texts from the term manager, friends, and a few from Lena, though she hadn't tried to reach out in days. He had stopped checking the messages. Stopped caring about what they said. The whiskey was his only companion now, and even that felt hollow. It didn't numb him the way it used to. It dulled the edges, but the pain was still there, lingering like a bruise that never healed. Nick sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the same spot on the wall, his thoughts circling in an endless loop. He was stuck, trapped in a spiral he couldn't escape. The breakup with Lena had been the final blow, but in truth, he had been unraveling long before that. Everything felt like it had been leading to this moment, to this suffocating sense of loss that no amount of alcohol or distraction could erase. Lena had been the last thread holding him together, even if their relationship had been toxic, even if it had been falling apart for months. Without her, Nick felt like he was falling into a void. There was no more fighting, no more clinging to the hope that they might somehow make things work. There was only the silence, and the crushing weight of everything he had lost. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. His mind felt foggy, clouded by the haze of whiskey and sleepless nights. But even in his half-dazed state, he couldn't escape the memories of Lena. He could still see her, sitting across from him on the bus, walking out of the hotel room, her back turned to him as she disappeared into the night. The memory of that last look haunted him. The way her eyes had been tired, resigned, as if she had already made her peace with the end. Nick hadn't. He hadn't accepted it. He didn't know how to. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the floor, but it was empty. He threw it across the room, the sound of shattering glass echoing in the silence. It didn't make him feel any better. Nothing did. The truth was, Nick didn't know how to be alone. Not without her. Not after everything they had been through. They had hurt each other, driven each other to the edge, but through it all, there had been this twisted comfort in knowing she was there. Even when they were at their worst, he had known she would come back. But now, for the first time, he realized she wasn't coming back. Not this time. He stood up, swaying slightly as he made his way to the bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered on, harsh and unforgiving, casting an eerie glow over his reflection. He looked like hell, his eyes bloodshot, dark circles etched under them, his face gaunt from too many sleepless nights and not enough food. His hands trembled as he braced himself against the sink, staring at the stranger in the mirror. Who am I without her? The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much of his life wrapped up in Lena, in their fights, their passion, their constant push and pull, that he didn't know how to be without her. She had been his anchor, even when that anchor had dragged him down into the depths. Nick turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on his face, hoping it would snap him out of this haze. But it didn't. The water dripped down his face, pooling in the sink, but all it did was remind him of how far he had fallen. He felt like he was drowning, and no amount of cold water could bring him back to the surface. He shut off the faucet and slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the cold tile floor. His head throbbed, a dull ache that refused to go away, and his chest felt tight, like there was a weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. I need to get out of here, he thought. I need to move, to do something. But the thought of leaving the room, of facing the world outside, felt impossible. He was trapped, not by the room itself, but by his own mind. The spiral had tightened around him, and he couldn't see a way out. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Nick ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, something in him snapped. He needed the distraction, even if it was just another reminder of everything he was avoiding. He crawled back to the bed, grabbed the phone, and glanced at the screen. It was Lena. The message was short, just 3 words. "I'm sorry, Nick." Nick stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to make of it. Was she sorry for the breakup? For leaving? For everything that had happened between them? Or was it just another reminder that she was gone for good, that there was no going back? He typed a response, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keyboard. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if there was anything left to say. But before he could send anything, he stopped. What would it change? An apology wouldn't fix what was broken. It wouldn't bring them back together. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret or sorrow could undo it. Nick let out a long, shaky breath and deleted the message. He didn't have the strength to respond. Not now. Maybe not ever. He dropped the phone back onto the bed and laid down, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. He was no good at goodbyes. He never had been. But this was different. This was final. And that was what scared him the most. The hours blurred together, and Nick lost track of time. The room was spinning, the world outside seemed distant, and his mind was caught in a loop of regrets and what-ifs. The sun began to rise, the first pale light seeping through the gaps in the curtains. Nick hadn't slept, hadn't moved from the bed in hours. He was too tired to keep fighting, too exhausted to keep going. But as the light filtered into the room, he realized something. He was still here. Still breathing. Still alive. The spiral hadn't swallowed him whole. Not yet. Nick sat up, his body aching, his mind foggy, but for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something small, something fragile, but something real. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the quiet resignation of someone who had finally accepted the truth. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. The spiral continued. But so did he.